All right, so we are going to end this lecture by talking about our sense of smell along with our sense of taste. So this is our olfaction being smell and then gustation being taste. So first off, we're going to look at our special sense of smell. So our special sense of smell has to do with the detection of what we'll call odorants in our environment, so in our external environment that we then inhale into our nose. It is going to be relayed to our brain via our first cranial nerve, which is known as the olfactory nerve. All right. So we'll talk about olfactory nerve whenever we do cranial nerves. We'll talk about optic and all these other ones that we've mentioned previously. And so whenever we look here, we see that we have this kind of inner layer here, which is representing the nasal cavity. And then we work our way up towards something known as the olfactory bulb. So here we're starting down here in the nasal cavity, right here, and we're working our way up to the olfactory bulb, right? So what you have happen is in the nasal cavity, you have odorants, okay? So this is some chemical in our environment. It could be from perfume, it could be from a cologne, from food, from whatever, all right? These odorants are then going to come across and they are going to bind to these sensory receptors on the end of our olfactory sensory neurons, right? So these are bipolar neurons, right? So these are bipolar neurons, like we had bipolar neurons in our retina. These cilia are going to extend out, and they're going to come in contact with the odorants that are in the environment, so that are within our olfactory mucosa. So speaking of olfactory mucosa, kind of this whole region that we have here. So you see we have some mucus here. We have a layer known as olfactory epithelium, and then we have another layer of loose connective tissue. So this is kind of all the loose connective tissue up here, and then all of this region, really all in here that you see highlighted here, this is all our olfactory epithelium with the mucus, the cilia, and our actual sensory neurons. Okay, so the sensory neurons are embedded within this olfactory epithelium. They're going to detect an odorant, and our neurons are very sensitive to these odorants. They can bind it. We can then generate a generator potential that's then going to send a signal and ultimately generate action potentials that travel along these bipolar neurons, and they're going to converge. And if you recall, whenever we did axial skeleton, this bone here, this is the ethmoid bone, and we have little holes that are called olfactory foramina. So these openings that you see here, these are the olfactory foramina that you see also right here as well. These axons of the bipolar neurons are going to extend through that olfactory foramina, and they're going to synapse onto these mitral cells that you see here. And then these are contained within this olfactory bulb. And then the olfactory bulb will leave, and we'll look at the picture in the next slide, leave this kind of area of the ethmoid bone as something known as the olfactory tract. Okay, and the olfactory tract will take this sense of smell back to our cerebral cortex, where we're then able to interpret it and perceive it as some type of smell. Okay, so our sense of smell is unique in that it is our only sense that does not go through the thalamus. So if you recall that all of our other senses, whether it's vision, whether it's taste, if it is hearing, or any of our somatic senses, our general senses, they all have to pass through the thalamus. Well, our sense of smell does not. So it can go to the hypothalamus, it can go to the cerebral cortex directly, and it can also go to parts of the limbic system, as we'll see in just a brief moment. So here's a cross-section through the kind of the nasal cavity where we just were. So here we see this olfactory epithelium, kind of all in this area here. You see this mucus kind of down in this region here. You have these glands, these olfactory glands that secrete this mucus, and then you have these odorants, right? So you have all these particles that are in the nasal cavity, right? They're then going to be they're going to stimulate the cilia, these sensory receptors on the ends. Here they're going to generate the generated potential, send action potentials along, go through those olfactory foramina to the olfactory bulb, and then these will all leave the olfactory bulb as the olfactory tract, again going back toward the cerebral cortex. So we can see here on a gross anatomical view, really all we can see is the olfactory bulb and olfactory tract. So we can't actually see the actual olfactory nerves. The olfactory nerves are these that extend down into the nasal cavity. These are sometimes referred to as fila olfactoria, or these olfactory fibers here, these olfactory nerves. But what we see on most models and most, if you do a brain dissection, is the olfactory bulb, which is kind of the swollen region that you see here, and then you can see the olfactory tract as it continues inferiorly here toward the temporal lobe. Okay, so you really can't see the actual olfactory nerves themselves because they're embedded within the olfactory epithelium within the nasal cavity. Okay, so the way that this signal is going to go is from the odorant, so from the chemicals in the air. They're going to stimulate these hairs, these olfactory hairs with the cilia. They're then going to travel up so stimulate the receptor, up the actual olfactory nerve fiber, so up these neurons, to our olfactory bulb that we see here, and then they leave the olfactory bulb as our olfactory tract that we saw in the previous picture. From there, they can go to the olfactory cortex, where we perceive and become conscious and aware of the smell. They could also go to the hypothalamus, and they could also go to the limbic system. So this limbic system has to do with our emotions, right? And so this is why certain smells can actually provoke emotions quite strongly because it can be distributed to the limbic system. So there's a strong link between emotions and feelings and smell as well. Okay, so talking about gustation now, gustation is going to be our special sense of taste. Okay, so when we look at our special sense of taste, we see and we think about our tongue. And on our tongue, we all know we have these taste buds, but what we actually see on the tongue are these small bumps known as papillae, or if we're talking about a singular one, it's known as a lingual papilla, all right? And the papillae are not the taste buds, okay? But within the papillae, or most of the papillae, you contain the taste buds, okay? Or these taste receptors, all right? So you can see there's papillae called foliate, circumvallate, fungiform, and filiform. Now, all of these contain taste buds except for the filiform papillae, and the filiform papillae are thought to kind of increase friction and help to keep the food in the mouth and help move it around the mouth as well. So they're not actually involved in the actual taste process or this gustation process. Okay. We also have these taste receptor cells. So here we see a receptor cell right here. We can have some stimulus, so some particle in our food or something. There are also cells known as basal cells, and these serve to replace old taste receptor cells. And we have the same thing in our olfactory epithelium that we just talked about. There are cells that are called basal epithelial cells, or these stem cells that can grow and divide and replicate and then ultimately replace old sensory neurons for the olfactory cells. So we see the same thing here in our tongue with our sense of taste. And then we have a thing called a taste pore, which kind of traps these food particles and these food molecules, allow them to stimulate the taste receptor cells with the taste receptors, and then we can send this signal back to the brain, specifically to a region of the brain known as the insula, this insular lobe, where we have our gustatory cortex, where we perceive taste. Okay, so when we look here at a section of our tongue, we can see these various papillae, and again, remember to associate the papillae with the taste buds, but they're not exactly the same. And remember, those filiform papillae, lingual papillae, do not contain the taste buds. Okay, so here we see filiform on the right. We see the filiform right here, and you can see how they're kind of sharp and kind of pointed. So again, they're serving to increase the friction of food on the tongue and help to move that food around the tongue. But you can see things like the fungiform, you can see the vallate, you can see the foliate as well. Okay. All right, so we have some primary tastes that we think about whenever we're eating different foods or drinking different things or things in our mouth. And these are sweet, salty, sour, and bitter. And then there's a fifth one that you may not be familiar with, which is umami. Okay, so if we talk about our sense of taste regarding sweet taste, this is going to be things like sugar and artificial sweeteners. Okay, so for some organic compound. We can also have things that are salty, so metal ions can stimulate this taste sensation, this taste perception, so things like sodium and potassium. We can also have sour taste, so with acids, vinegar, maybe sour candy. You can have things that are bitter as well, so maybe certain types of chocolate, caffeine, nicotine. And then umami, this is this savory flavor that you typically associate with meat. Okay, so this kind of meaty flavor due to the amino acids and the proteins associated with the actual meat itself. All right, so there are different ways that these tastes get generated. So whenever we eat something that is salty and sour, that is we become aware of that via a different mechanism and a different process than how we become aware of sweet, bitter, and umami. Okay, so the exact mechanism is not important, but do know that it is slightly different for salty and sour, and then sweet, bitter, and umami are slightly different. Okay, so we have a couple of different gustatory pathways, and we'll talk about these. One is we can activate those taste receptors, right? So here we see a lingual papilla. So this is a valate papilla. We have a taste spore that's going to trap that food particle. We have the gustatory cell. It can bring it in. It's going to stimulate our sensory neuron. We can then send a signal down the axon of our sensory neuron toward our brain, where we then interpret that as a certain type of taste. Now, we'll see in a little bit that different parts of the tongue have taste sensations transmitted by a different nerve, and we will we'll see this in just a little bit. Okay, so you can also have sensory neurons connect to multiple gustatory cells in the tongue and project to the medulla. All right, and so this is where we have different parts of the tongue be innervated by different nerves. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue are going to be innervated by the facial nerve, or our seventh cranial nerve, and there's specifically a branch that we'll look at in a second, known as the chorda tympani nerve, and this is the specific nerve branch of the facial nerve that innervates the anterior 2/3 of the tongue. Now, the posterior third of the tongue is innervated by the glossopharyngeal nerve, which is our ninth cranial nerve. All right. So these differences in innervation, the nerve have to do with the origins of the tongue and the origin of these nerves during embryological development. So the anterior 2/3 of the tongue and the posterior third originate from different parts, so they receive different sensory innervation. Okay, or in this case, special sensory innervation for taste. Okay. You can also have neurons project to the thalamus. So again, this is a sense, so it's going to project through the thalamus, unlike our sense of smell, which does not. And then they can also project to the gustatory cortex and our insula. Okay, so we'll look at the insular lobe here briefly. So when we look at this is our facial nerve, and this is part of our temporal bone right here. This is our temporal bone. Here's our facial nerve right here. So here's our facial nerve, this kind of long, slender, kind of curving nerve, and it exits at the base of the skull in the stylomastoid foramen. But you see this very small, thin nerve. You can see it here, and it comes all the way down, and I tried to circle it here, kind of covered it a little bit. But this is the nerve known as the chorda tympani nerve. So I'm gonna try to circle it again here. So this is our chorda tympani nerve, all right here, running all the way down. Okay, and it continues down here as well, and joins a part of our trigeminal nerve right here. So this is the nerve that actually stimulates or provides sensory innervation to the anterior 2/3 of our tongue. Now, you may notice that this region right here, well, this is our ear, right? This is our middle ear. This is the tympanic membrane, and here we have our malleus and incus and stapes. So this nerve, and what I'm about to tell you, this is kind of hypothetical. It doesn't necessarily happen, but it could. This chorda tympani nerve, let me clear this a little bit. This chorda tympani nerve travels right next to the tympanic membrane. Okay, so that's why it's called tympani. Chorda tympani refers to the tympanic and refers to ear. The term chord, a chord is a line that crosses a circle in more than one area. So if you draw a circle, right, and you draw one line, right in the middle, it doesn't really cross that circle in more than one area. Okay, but if you draw a circle and then you draw a line across it where it crosses in two places, right? So it crosses right here and it crosses right here. That's called a chord. So this chorda tympani, that's where we get this name, and it passes right next to the tympanic membrane. So if the tympanic membrane were to, and it's actually next to a part of the tympanic membrane that doesn't really move a lot whenever the tympanic membrane is moving in response to sound waves. And that's a good thing. If it were, and this nerve were to be stimulated whenever the tympanic membrane moved, and again, this nerve is innervating our tongue for taste. So what could theoretically happen is that whenever we have certain sound waves hitting our tympanic membrane, moving the ossicles, and that moves this nerve as well, what you could get is you could get a synesthesia. And so a synesthesia is when you have certain senses get kind of crossed. So two senses that don't typically go together, they suddenly are kind of swapped for one another. So what you could have is you could have certain sounds taste differently. Okay, so I'll say that again. You could have a sound and you could perceive that as a taste. Okay, so it's because this nerve that is being that is stimulating the sensory aspect of our tongue for taste, the anterior 2/3. If it was to be moved and stimulated by sound waves, that would bring back sensory innervation from the tongue, but we may perceive it as sound. So we could, or it would still be taste, but it would a certain sound would result in a particular taste. Okay, now this is really hypothetical. It's not really happening, but it's something that could happen if for some reason this nerve were to be stimulated by and aggravated and irritated by this tympanic membrane. Okay, so kind of interesting. All right, so we also know that our sense of taste can be affected by smell as well. So whenever you are sick and you have to take certain medications and maybe you hold your nose, you don't taste that medication as much, right? Whenever you have certain illnesses, it may affect your sense of smell, and so the things that you eat just don't have the same taste to it as well either. So what this is really saying is that part of our ability to quote unquote taste things, it's actually our sense of smell. Okay, so our sense of smell provides the flavor associated with certain foods. Okay, so you have to have this sense of smell along with the stimulation of food molecules and particles, stimulating sensory receptors in our taste buds. You kind of have to have both of these things working together in order for us to actually be able to, interpret food as having a certain flavor. Okay, one of those flavors we talked about previously. Okay, so we are done with this lecture. So we've covered lots. We've covered in the previous lecture we covered vision, but here we talked about hearing and we talked about balance. We talked about smell. We talked about taste. So again, go through this lecture, go through the book, and as always, feel free to email me if you have any questions, and I will be happy to help. All right, I will see you in the next video.